Hello everyone, I'm really glad you're here. Tonight, I want to help you let go of the day and ease into rest. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, and it means a lot to be part of your nightly routine. So, if you haven't already, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It truly helps. Now, settle in, close your eyes, and let's begin the first story. Nick had been driving trucks alongside his twin brother Raymond for nearly 2 decades. Their latest assignment seemed routine enough. A haul from Houston to Los Angeles, then up to Vancouver. What should have been a straightforward journey would become the most terrifying experience of their lives. After spending a relaxing week with their cousin in LA, the brothers set out for Vancouver in the evening hours. Raymond took the first shift, while Nick settled into the passenger seat with a McDonald's cheeseburger. The highway stretched ahead, illuminated by their headlights cutting through the darkness. Without warning, construction signs forced them off the main interstate onto a narrow backcountry road. "We'll reconnect further up," Raymond said, but as the hours passed, the road seemed to lead deeper into wilderness. Flat farmland gave way to dense forest, and by midnight they hadn't encountered another vehicle. The forest pressed in on both sides, creating a tunnel of shadows that their headlights barely penetrated. An oppressive silence hung over everything. No wind rustling the leaves, no distant sounds of civilization, just the steady hum of their diesel engine. "I need to stop," Raymond finally announced, pulling over to the shoulder. As he disappeared into the tree line, Nick decided to check their cargo. The moment he stepped outside, a nauseating smell hit him, the unmistakable stench of rotting flesh. His stomach churned as he tried to locate the source. "Hey, Nick," came Raymond's voice from behind him. His brother emerged from the woods, looking pale and shaken. "Did you see that light in the trees?" Before Nick could respond, Raymond's expression changed to one of horror as he stared past Nick's shoulder. Following his gaze, Nick looked through their truck's windshield and felt his blood freeze. Hanging from the trees were human bodies, dozens of them, swaying gently in the still air. Some appeared fresh, their clothes still intact. Others were in various stages of decomposition. One corpse had been grotesquely mutilated, its torso split open like a broken doll. Nick fumbled for his flashlight, the beam confirming their worst fears. At least 12 bodies hung from makeshift nooses, creating a macabre forest gallery. The sight was so disturbing that Nick doubled over, fighting the urge to vomit. "Turn off the light," Raymond whispered urgently. In the sudden darkness, they saw it, a flickering glow deep in the woods, moving slowly but deliberately toward them. The light danced between the trees like a will-o'-the-wisp, but there was something purposeful about its movement. Raymond grabbed Nick's arm with bruising force and shoved him toward the truck. "Get in, now." They slammed the doors, and Raymond gunned the engine, gravel spraying as they lurched back onto the road. In the side mirror, Nick watched as dark figures emerged from the forest. 5, maybe 10 people standing exactly where their truck had been parked moments before. One figure stood taller than the others, wearing what looked like a skull or grotesque mask. Even from a distance, Nick could feel its malevolent presence watching them flee. They drove in stunned silence for hours, not stopping until they reached a brightly lit truck stop on the main highway. While Nick pumped fuel with shaking hands, Raymond called the police, then their boss, reporting what they'd witnessed in voices that cracked with trauma. The remainder of their journey to Vancouver passed in a blur of paranoid glances in mirrors and minimal conversation. They made no unnecessary stops, speaking only when absolutely required. Weeks later, they learned they may have stumbled into territory controlled by a remote cult. Rumors spoke of ritual sacrifices, organ harvesting, and systematic killings in the wilderness between California and Oregon. The authorities had no official records, no missing persons reports that matched what they'd seen. The experience shattered something fundamental in both brothers. Nick quit long-haul trucking within a month, taking a local delivery job that kept him close to home. Raymond continued driving, but the light had gone out of his eyes. He refused to discuss that night, and their once close relationship became strained by the weight of shared horror. To this day, Nick cannot drive past dense forests without remembering those swaying bodies and the tall figure with its skull-like mask. Sometimes, in his dreams, he still sees that flickering light moving through the trees, searching for its next victims in the endless darkness of the woods. Story 2. Marie had been driving the lonely highways of Texas for over 20 years. But nothing had prepared her for the night she encountered something that defied all logic and reason. It was late November, and she was hauling freight through a remote stretch of desert highway. The road ran straight as an arrow through miles of empty wasteland, with no towns, gas stations, or signs of civilization visible in any direction. This kind of isolation usually brought her peace, but tonight felt different. The air seemed unnaturally heavy, pressing down on her chest and making each breath feel labored. Her headlights carved a narrow path through the darkness, revealing nothing but cracked asphalt stretching endlessly ahead. At 11:47 p.m., she first noticed the headlights in her rearview mirror, two distant points of light that appeared suddenly on the empty road behind her. At first, she thought nothing of it. Other drivers occasionally traveled these remote routes, though it was unusual to encounter anyone at this hour. But as the minutes passed, something began to feel wrong. The car maintained the exact same distance behind her, never gaining ground despite her steady 65 miles per hour pace. Any normal vehicle should have either caught up to pass or fallen behind by now. Marie found herself checking the mirror obsessively every few minutes. The headlights remained perfectly positioned, like eyes watching her from the darkness. Her palms began to sweat as an inexplicable sense of dread crept over her. After 30 minutes of this unnatural following, Marie decided to test her pursuer. She gradually reduced her speed, first to 50 miles per hour, then 40, then barely crawling at 30 miles per hour. The mysterious vehicle maintained its distance exactly as if connected to her truck by an invisible tether. Growing desperate, Marie brought her truck to a complete stop in the middle of the empty highway. She sat in the sudden silence, staring into her rearview mirror and waiting for the car to approach. But when she looked again, the road behind her was completely empty. The headlights had vanished as if they had never existed. Confused and shaken, Marie continued driving, trying to rationalize what she'd experienced. Perhaps the driver had turned off their lights or taken an exit she hadn't noticed. But the road was completely straight, with no turnoffs for miles in either direction. 15 minutes later, the headlights reappeared in her mirror, occupying the exact same position as before. Marie's hands began to tremble on the steering wheel as she realized this was no ordinary encounter. The phantom pursuit continued for another hour, the mysterious vehicle maintaining its impossible distance, while Marie's sanity began to fray. She considered pulling over at the next gas station, but something told her that stopping wouldn't help, that whatever was following her existed beyond the normal rules of physics and logic. Without warning, the headlights began to move closer. Marie watched in growing terror as they approached rapidly, filling her mirrors with brilliant white light. She floored the accelerator, pushing her truck to 70, then 80 miles per hour. But the lights continued gaining ground. Just as the pursuer seemed about to overtake her, it suddenly veered off into the darkness, disappearing as mysteriously as it had appeared. Marie didn't slow down until she reached a rundown gas station miles ahead, where she sat in the parking lot with her engine running, afraid to turn it off. The elderly attendant noticed her distress and shared a knowing look. "You're not the first trucker to see something strange on that road," he said quietly. "Some folks say there's a haunted car that follows drivers out there. Never actually does anything, just scares the hell out of people." Marie never took that route again, choosing longer paths that added hours to her journeys rather than risk another encounter with whatever had stalked her through the Texas desert that night. Story 3. For 20 years, Marie had found solace in the isolation of long-haul trucking. The endless highways and empty landscapes provided a peaceful refuge from the complications of human interaction. But one foggy November night in the Appalachian Mountains would shatter her sense of security forever. She was running a late delivery from North Carolina to West Virginia, a route she'd traveled dozens of times before. The familiar mountain roads held no surprises, just switchbacks and steep grades that required attention but not anxiety. Tonight, however, a thick fog had rolled in, reducing visibility to mere feet. Her headlights struggled to penetrate the dense mist that seemed to swallow the world around her. The fog clung to the ground like a living thing, transforming the familiar landscape into an alien environment where nothing looked quite right. It was around 2 a.m. when Marie first heard the whisper, a soft murmur that seemed to come from inside the cab itself. At first, she dismissed it as wind or engine noise, but the sound persisted, growing gradually more distinct, though the words remained unintelligible. The voice was cold and urgent, speaking in a language she couldn't understand, but which filled her with inexplicable dread. It seemed to emanate from directly behind her ear, as if someone were leaning over her shoulder and speaking in hushed, desperate tones. Marie turned up the radio, hoping to drown out the disturbing sound, but found only static on every station. The isolation of the mountains meant no signal could penetrate, leaving her alone with the mysterious whispers that grew more insistent with each passing mile. As she navigated a sharp curve, movement in her rearview mirror caught her attention. For just a moment, she glimpsed a shadow disappearing into the fog behind her, a human-shaped silhouette that vanished before she could focus on it properly. Her heart began racing as she realized she wasn't alone on this isolated mountain road. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if trying to warn her of some approaching danger. But warn her of what and who was speaking? The shadows in her mirror became more frequent, always appearing at the edge of her vision and vanishing when she tried to look directly at them. Each glimpse was brief but unmistakable, the outline of a person standing in the fog, watching her truck pass. By 4 a.m., Marie was on the verge of panic. The whispers had become a constant murmur of unintelligible words, and the shadows in her mirror now appeared every few minutes. The fog seemed to be getting thicker, pressing against her windshield like grasping fingers. Then she saw it clearly, a pale face staring back at her from the rear seat of her cab. The features were gaunt and colorless, with dark, hollow eyes that seemed to look straight through her. The mouth moved as if speaking, but no sound emerged except the continued whispers that filled the cab. Marie spun around to confront whatever had invaded her truck, but the back seat was empty. When she looked in the mirror again, the face was gone, but she could still feel its presence. A cold, malevolent awareness that watched her every move. The radio suddenly crackled to life, and through the static came a voice speaking her name. Marie, it said in tones that seemed to rise from the depths of the earth. Don't look back. The warning was repeated over and over, each repetition more urgent than the last. Marie's hands shook as she gripped the steering wheel, fighting the compulsion to check her mirror. Every instinct screamed at her to see what was behind her, but the voice's warning held her back. Finally, the fog began to lift as dawn approached, and the whispers faded to nothing. Marie drove straight to the nearest diner and sat in the parking lot until the sun was fully up, too shaken to continue her journey until daylight restored her sense of reality. She never drove through those mountains again, but sometimes, on quiet nights when she's alone on dark highways, she still hears that voice whispering her name and warning her never to look back. Story 4. The isolation of trucking had always been one of its greatest appeals for veteran driver Frank. After decades on the road, he'd learned to appreciate the solitude of empty highways and the peaceful rhythm of long-distance hauling. But one night in the Nevada desert would teach him that sometimes the most dangerous encounters happen when you think you're completely alone. Frank was hauling freight through a particularly desolate stretch of highway, the kind where you could drive for hours without seeing another vehicle or sign of human habitation. It was past midnight when his truck began making concerning noises, a faint sputtering that gradually worsened until the engine died completely, leaving him stranded on the roadside. The silence that followed was oppressive. No wind stirred the desert air. No insects chirped in the darkness. Even the distant hum of highway traffic was absent, leaving Frank surrounded by a vacuum of sound that pressed against his eardrums. He tried the CB radio, calling for assistance, but received only static in response. His cell phone showed no signal. He was truly alone in the middle of nowhere, with no way to call for help and no idea when another vehicle might pass. As he stood beside his disabled truck, assessing his situation, headlights appeared in the distance. Relief flooded through him as an old pickup truck approached and stopped nearby. The driver who emerged was tall and gaunt, with worn clothes and an unsettling manner that immediately put Frank on edge. "Need some help?" the stranger asked, but something in his voice, too eager, too interested, triggered Frank's survival instincts. When the man offered to tow Frank's truck to a secluded location where he claimed to have tools, every warning bell in Frank's mind began ringing. Frank politely declined, saying he'd rather wait for professional assistance. The stranger's demeanor shifted slightly, his eyes narrowing as he studied Frank with calculating intensity. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken tension. When the man finally returned to his truck, Frank expected him to drive away. Instead, the pickup remained parked nearby, its engine idling while the driver sat motionless behind the wheel. Minutes turned to an hour, and still the truck didn't move. Frank climbed back into his cab and locked the doors, watching the stranger's vehicle through his mirrors. His palms grew slick with sweat as the reality of his situation became clear. He was trapped and vulnerable, with no means of escape and no way to call for help. The stranger eventually got out of his truck and approached Frank's cab with slow, deliberate steps. He knocked on the door, his voice taking on a menacing tone as he demanded that Frank open up for a talk. The pretense of offering help had been abandoned entirely. Frank gripped a tire iron from under his seat, preparing to defend himself if necessary. The stranger knocked again, harder this time, his voice growing more threatening. Just as he reached for the door handle, headlights appeared in the distance. Another truck approaching on the highway. The stranger immediately abandoned his aggressive approach and returned to his vehicle. As the other trucker pulled up behind Frank's disabled rig, the mysterious pickup sped away into the night, disappearing as suddenly as it had appeared. The rescue trucker offered to stay with Frank until a tow truck arrived, and they spent the remainder of the night sharing coffee and conversation. Frank never saw the strange pickup again, but the encounter left him permanently changed. He realized how close he'd come to becoming a victim of whatever dark intentions the stranger harbored. The man's behavior had been that of a predator who knew exactly how to exploit the vulnerability of stranded travelers. From that night forward, Frank approached every roadside encounter with heightened caution, knowing that help offered by strangers might come with a price too terrible to imagine. Story 5. After 11 straight hours of driving through New Mexico's desert highways, veteran trucker Sam needed rest. His eyelids were growing heavy, and he knew better than to push himself beyond safe limits. When a rest stop sign appeared, promising facilities just 2 miles ahead, it seemed like perfect timing. The rest area was almost deserted when Sam pulled in. Just 2 other trucks parked at the far end of the lot, their cabs dark and apparently unoccupied. The facility itself was minimal. A few parking spaces, some picnic tables, and a run-down restroom building, illuminated by a single flickering streetlight. Something about the place felt off immediately. The silence was too complete, too heavy. No wind rustled through the sparse vegetation. No insects buzzed in the night air. Even the usual distant hum of highway traffic was absent, creating an oppressive quiet that seemed to press against Sam's ears. He parked his rig in the middle of the lot, not too close to the other trucks, but not isolated at the edges either. As he sat in his cab, adjusting to the stillness, an uneasiness crept over him that he couldn't quite explain. After grabbing his flashlight, Sam made his way to the restroom building. The structure was in worse condition than it had appeared from a distance. The door hung crooked on its hinges, and graffiti covered walls that reeked of neglect and decay. Inside, the light switch produced no response, leaving Sam dependent on his flashlight beam to navigate the cracked tiles and peeling paint. As he used the facilities, he heard footsteps outside, soft at first, then growing more distinct, as if someone were walking slowly around the building. Sam froze, listening intently. The rest stop had been empty when he'd arrived. The 2 trucks at the far end of the lot had remained dark and silent. So who was walking around outside? When he emerged from the restroom and swept his flashlight across the area, he saw nothing but empty pavement and shadows. The footsteps had stopped, leaving only the oppressive silence that had greeted his arrival. Halfway back to his truck, Sam spotted him, a man standing motionless by one of the picnic tables. The figure was barely visible in the darkness, hands buried in the pockets of a heavy jacket, face hidden by a hood pulled low over his head. Sam was certain the man hadn't been there when he'd gotten out of his truck. The rest area had been completely empty just minutes before. Yet there he stood, perfectly still, as if he'd been waiting there for hours. The man's posture was unnaturally rigid, like a statue positioned among the tables. Sam couldn't make out his face, but something about his stillness was deeply unsettling. It wasn't the relaxed pose of someone taking a break. It was the motionless stance of a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. Sam forced himself to keep walking toward his truck, fighting the urge to run. When he glanced back over his shoulder, the man was still there, still watching, still perfectly motionless in the shadows. Once safely inside his cab with the doors locked, Sam peered out the window again. The man had vanished as mysteriously as he'd appeared, leaving no trace that he'd ever been there at all. Sam lay down on his bunk, trying to rest, but sleep wouldn't come. Every sound, real or imagined, made him tense with alertness. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, as if invisible eyes were studying his every movement. About an hour later, he heard them footsteps circling his truck with slow, deliberate precision. The sound was unmistakable, someone walking around his rig, examining it from every angle. Sam grabbed his flashlight and shined it through the windows, but saw nothing except empty pavement. Yet the footsteps continued, growing bolder, moving closer to the cab itself. Then came the knocking, soft taps on the driver's side door, almost polite in their restraint. Sam held his breath, hoping whoever was outside would give up and leave. Instead, the knocking shifted to the passenger side, then to the back of the cab, as if multiple people were surrounding his truck. The knocks became more insistent, more demanding. Sam fumbled for his phone, but there was no cellular signal in this remote location. He was completely cut off from help, trapped inside his cab, while unknown figures prowled outside in the darkness. In desperation, Sam slammed his fist on the horn, sending a loud blast echoing across the empty rest stop. The knocking stopped immediately, and moments later, headlights appeared as another vehicle pulled into the lot. As the car's lights swept across the area, Sam saw them clearly. 3 figures in dark clothing standing around his truck, their faces hidden by hoods. When the bright beams hit them, they scattered like roaches exposed to light, disappearing into the desert darkness. Sam didn't wait to see if they would return. He started his engine and drove straight out of the rest stop, not stopping until he reached a well-lit truck stop hours later. He learned later that the remote rest area had a dark reputation among drivers. Several truckers had reported similar encounters, and some had simply vanished, their rigs found abandoned, but with no trace of the drivers themselves. Sam never stopped at isolated rest areas again, choosing instead to push through fatigue rather than risk another encounter with the watchers who prowled the darkness, waiting for lone travelers foolish enough to stop. Story 6. Sarah was 18 and fresh out of high school when she encountered a danger that would forever change how she viewed the open road. Driving home from college for her brother's wedding, she was navigating the busy interstate traffic of Tennessee when she noticed something disturbing in her rearview mirror. A semi-truck had positioned itself directly behind her car, maintaining an uncomfortably close distance despite the heavy afternoon traffic. At first, Sarah assumed the driver simply wanted to pass, so she moved to the right lane to give him space. But instead of overtaking her, the truck moved with her, staying directly behind her vehicle. Then the light flashing began. The trucker flashed his headlights repeatedly, followed by honking and waving. Sarah's initial thought was that something might be wrong with her car. Perhaps the tire patch she'd gotten the week before had failed, or there was some other mechanical issue she couldn't detect. Concerned for her safety, Sarah decided to exit at the next off-ramp to check her vehicle at a gas station. She wasn't expecting the truck to follow her, but it did, pulling into the same parking lot and positioning itself in the designated truck zone. As Sarah examined her car, she found nothing wrong. Her tires were fine, there was no smoke or unusual sounds, and everything appeared to be in perfect working order. But the truck driver was already climbing down from his cab and walking in her direction. Sarah positioned herself strategically by her open driver's door, keeping the gas pump between herself and the approaching man. She had her phone ready with 911 already dialed, her finger hovering over the call button. Every instinct told her this situation was dangerous. The man appeared to be in his late 30s or early 40s, average build, nothing particularly threatening about his appearance. But his first words sent chills down Sarah's spine. "Well, ain't you a pretty little thing?" Sarah forced a tight smile and thanked him politely, trying not to show her fear. The man immediately began asking personal questions. Where was she from? Where was she headed? Was she in college? Each question felt like an invasion, a probing attempt to gather information about her vulnerability. Some protective instinct took over, and Sarah found herself lying about everything. She gave him a fake hometown, made up a fictional school, and claimed she was just making a short trip to visit nearby family. She kept her answers vague and tried to end the conversation as quickly as possible. The man offered to pay for her gas, which Sarah politely declined. She didn't want him to think she owed him anything or create any sense of obligation between them. The entire interaction felt like a carefully orchestrated, predatory approach. Throughout their brief conversation, the man kept glancing at her phone, where the 911 screen remained visible. Whether this deterred him from escalating the situation, or if he had always planned to keep things seemingly innocent, Sarah would never know. As soon as the gas pump clicked off, Sarah quickly thanked him again, got into her car, and drove away as fast as she dared without drawing attention. She watched her mirrors carefully, but the truck didn't follow her back onto the highway. The encounter lasted only a few minutes, but it left Sarah permanently changed. She realized how vulnerable she had been. A young woman alone on an isolated off-ramp with a stranger whose intentions were clearly not benign. The way he had followed her, the personal questions, the inappropriate comment about her appearance, all of it pointed to someone who saw her as potential prey. Sarah's biggest regret was not reporting the incident to authorities. At the time, she just wanted to forget it had happened and continue her journey home. But she later realized that her silence might have put other young women at risk from the same predator. The experience taught her valuable lessons about trusting her instincts and taking precautions when traveling alone. She began carrying pepper spray, always kept her phone charged and ready, and never again ignored the warning signals that had probably saved her from becoming a victim. Years later, Sarah still remembered every detail of that encounter: the man's face, his truck, his voice, and especially the predatory gleam in his eyes when he first approached her. She often wondered what would have happened if another vehicle hadn't been nearby, or if she hadn't had her phone ready to call for help. The incident also changed how she viewed truck drivers in general. While she knew most were honest, hard-working people, she could never again see a semi-truck without remembering that predators could be found in any profession, using their mobility and the anonymity of the road to target vulnerable travelers. Sarah's story serves as a reminder that danger can appear in the most ordinary circumstances, wearing the mask of helpfulness while harboring the darkest of intentions. Story 7. 21-year-old Jessica was driving back to college after a weekend visit with her parents when she encountered a truck driver whose behavior escalated from annoying to genuinely terrifying. The 2-hour journey on a mostly empty 3-lane highway should have been routine, but it became a nightmare of persistent stalking and intimidation. Jessica was in her father's old pickup truck, singing along to the radio and enjoying the drive. She was in the far left lane, relaxed and happy, when she noticed a semi-truck in the far right lane, matching her speed exactly. At first, she was simply embarrassed that someone had seen her dancing and singing in her seat. She tried speeding up to get ahead of the truck and out of view, but to her surprise, the driver sped up as well, maintaining the same relative position. When she looked over to see who was driving, she saw a middle-aged, balding man in a faded blue t-shirt. He was smiling and waving at her with what initially seemed like friendliness. Jessica gave a small, awkward wave back, expecting that to be the end of the interaction. But the truck driver had other plans. He merged into the center lane, now just 1 lane away from her, and continued waving with an overly enthusiastic smile that felt increasingly uncomfortable. What followed was a terrifying game of cat and mouse. No matter what Jessica did, speeding up, slowing down, changing lanes, the truck driver matched her movements perfectly. He seemed to anticipate her every move, using other vehicles on the road to trap her and prevent her from escaping his attention. The driver's experience with this type of harassment was evident in how skillfully he manipulated traffic patterns. When other cars approached in his lane, he would wait until the last possible second before swerving around them, then immediately return to blocking Jessica's escape routes. For 5 straight miles, Jessica couldn't break free from his pursuit. Throughout the ordeal, the driver maintained his disturbing smile and continued waving. At one point, he began holding up his index finger in a number 1 gesture, the meaning of which Jessica couldn't fathom, but which made her skin crawl. Recognizing that this was no longer harmless flirtation, but genuine stalking, Jessica called 911. She provided the dispatcher with a detailed description of the truck: white trailer, black cab, Pennsylvania license plates, and explained the situation as it was happening. The dispatcher advised Jessica to pull over onto the shoulder, but the left shoulder was narrow and unsafe. Jessica expressed her fear of stopping in such a vulnerable position with an aggressive pursuer so close behind her. When the truck driver got briefly stuck behind slower traffic, Jessica seized the opportunity to drop back quickly, switch lanes, and surge forward into the far right lane. For a moment, it seemed like she had escaped, but the driver managed to catch up and continue his pursuit. Following the dispatcher's instructions, Jessica exited at the next service plaza, hoping the driver wouldn't follow her off the highway. The dispatcher assured her this would likely end the harassment, but she was wrong. With no warning signals or brake lights, the truck driver somehow anticipated Jessica's move and followed her into the service plaza. This level of prediction suggested he had done this before and knew how to read his victim's likely responses. The service plaza was designed with separate routes for trucks and regular vehicles. As Jessica parked near the main entrance, she watched the truck take the designated route that looped behind the building. Throughout the entire circuit, the driver stared at her with an intensity that made her blood run cold. Not wanting to remain a sitting target, Jessica moved to a nearby gas station that overlooked the truck parking area. She hoped this would provide a better vantage point while she waited for police to arrive. From her new position, Jessica watched in horror as the truck driver exited his vehicle and began walking toward the service plaza. Instead of going inside like a normal customer, he ducked behind a concrete pillar and stood there watching her truck with the patience of a practiced predator. When Jessica reported this behavior to the dispatcher, she was told to hold tight as officers were almost there. But the driver's behavior became increasingly bold. He emerged from behind the pillar and walked directly toward Jessica's abandoned truck, circling it slowly while smiling in a way that was no longer friendly but calculating and dark. The sight of this stranger examining her vehicle like he was looking for a way inside triggered Jessica's flight response. Despite the dispatcher's pleas to wait for police, she put her truck in drive and fled the service plaza at high speed. The dispatcher apologized and assured Jessica that officers would still check the area, but advised her to focus on getting home safely. Jessica never learned whether police found the driver or what consequences, if any, he faced for his behavior. The most disturbing aspect of the entire ordeal was Jessica's realization that none of it would have happened if she hadn't been alone. The driver had specifically targeted her because she appeared to be a vulnerable young woman traveling without protection. This incident taught Jessica harsh lessons about the predatory behavior that some people engage in when they think they can act with impunity. It also reinforced the importance of trusting one's instincts and taking immediate action when a situation feels dangerous. Story 8. 13-year-old Marcus was alone at his family's remote cattle ranch when a late-night delivery turned into one of the most disturbing experiences of his young life. His parents had traveled to Dallas with his sister, leaving him to handle a routine cattle shipment from Nebraska, something he'd done many times before, but never without adult supervision. The ranch sat 5 miles down a gravel road, surrounded by endless open pasture land, with the nearest neighbor 2 miles away. Marcus was accustomed to the isolation, and accepting livestock deliveries was a familiar routine. His father's only instruction had been clear: don't tell the driver you're alone. Midnight came and went, with no sign of the expected truck. Around 1 a.m., Marcus finally spotted headlights in the distance. But instead of approaching normally, the truck stopped in the middle of the road and remained there for over 30 minutes. No movement, no one getting out, just headlights sitting motionless in the darkness. When the truck finally began moving again, it crept down the gravel road at an unnaturally slow pace before pulling up to the loading chute. Marcus went out to meet the driver and immediately sensed something was wrong. The driver looked completely disheveled, his clothes covered in dirt and stains, as if he'd been wearing them for days without washing. He began mumbling about being late, offering a series of contradictory explanations: a flat tire, then animals on the road, then fuel problems. None of his stories made coherent sense. Then the driver asked how old Marcus was. Following his father's instructions, Marcus gave a vague response about being old enough to help out. The driver stared at him for a long moment before launching into a disturbing story about his past relationships, including inappropriate details about dating someone he later discovered was related to him. The conversation felt calculated rather than casual, as if the driver was testing Marcus's reactions or trying to make him uncomfortable. Marcus kept his responses minimal and suggested they start unloading the cattle, mentioning that his mother was waiting inside the house. The unloading process revealed the driver's true intentions. As they released each group of cattle from the trailer compartments, the driver repeatedly asked Marcus to come inside the enclosed trailer to help with the inner gates. This was not a normal request. Marcus had helped with dozens of deliveries and had never been asked to enter the trailer. Each time, Marcus declined, staying outside to count the animals as they emerged. The driver became more insistent and frustrated. His demeanor shifted from false friendliness to barely contained anger as Marcus continued to refuse his requests. The pattern repeated with every compartment. The driver would claim he needed help inside the trailer. Marcus would decline and stay in the open where he felt safer, and the driver would grow increasingly agitated by the boy's refusal to be lured into the confined space. For the final test, the driver told Marcus to climb into the truck cab and retrieve the delivery slip from the glove compartment. Again, Marcus refused, unwilling to turn his back on the man or enter another enclosed space where he would be vulnerable. The driver's frustration was now obvious as he realized his various tactics weren't working. He retrieved the delivery slip himself and handed it to Marcus with obvious reluctance. As soon as the paperwork was signed, Marcus declared the delivery complete and headed back to the house. But the ordeal wasn't over. From the safety of the house, Marcus watched through the window as the truck remained parked in their driveway for over an hour. The driver just sat there in the darkness, perhaps hoping Marcus would come back outside, or trying to determine if anyone else was actually in the house. Marcus didn't feel safe enough to sleep until he finally saw the truck's taillights disappearing down the gravel road. What should have been a routine 20-minute delivery had stretched into hours of psychological manipulation and intimidation. Years later, Marcus realized how close he had come to becoming a victim. The driver's repeated attempts to lure him into confined spaces, his inappropriate conversation, and his reluctance to leave all pointed to someone with predatory intentions who had specifically chosen to target what he believed was an isolated and vulnerable child. The experience taught Marcus valuable lessons about trusting his instincts and recognizing dangerous behavior, even when it's disguised as normal interaction. His father's simple instruction to never admit being alone had probably saved him from a tragedy that could have destroyed his family. Story 9. 17-year-old Maria made a decision that nearly cost her everything when she snuck out of her house late one night to search for something she thought she needed. Living in a small town where everyone knew everyone, she felt safe walking the familiar streets in darkness. But she was about to learn that predators can hide in the most ordinary circumstances. Maria had grown up in a predominantly Hispanic community where she felt completely at home. The streets between her neighborhood and her destination were ones she'd walked countless times during the day. On this particular night, she was on a video call with her boyfriend, who stayed on the line to keep her company during her late-night errand. The route required crossing railroad tracks, and the only illumination came from a distant warehouse and a few scattered streetlights near the main road. As Maria approached the main road, she noticed a semi-truck parked on the side, not an unusual sight in her town, where truckers often stopped to rest. From the truck came a voice calling out in Spanish, "Hola, hey." Maria looked over and saw a Hispanic man in a red, long-sleeved shirt leaning out of the cab window. He appeared to be just another ordinary person from her community, but something about his smile didn't feel right to her. Being polite, Maria waved back as the man continued speaking to her in Spanish. Since Maria didn't speak Spanish fluently, despite growing up in a Hispanic community, she called back, "No hablo español," and continued walking. Her boyfriend, still on the phone, asked who it was, and Maria dismissed it as just a random truck driver. Maria spent about 40 minutes searching for what she was looking for, but never found it. With her phone battery dying and her boyfriend advising her to head home, she began the return journey. But as she looked down the dark street leading back toward the railroad tracks, an inexplicable feeling of dread washed over her. Every instinct told her not to go that way, so instead she turned toward the warehouse where the lighting was better. The brighter area made her feel safer, even though it was a longer route home. She walked past some empty trailers, sitting in the shadows near the building, feeling more secure in the illuminated space. That's when she heard it again. "Hey!" Maria spun around to find the same truck driver standing behind one of the trailers, as if he had been waiting for her. The same unsettling smile was on his face, but now he had one hand jammed in his pocket and was angling his body as if hiding something behind his back. The man motioned with his free hand for Maria to come closer. She didn't move, instead telling her boyfriend urgently to wake up his father and come get her immediately. Her heart was pounding as she began backing away from the figure who had somehow known exactly where to find her. The moment the man realized Maria was on the phone, his expression changed completely. The fake smile vanished, replaced by anger and frustration. He began ducking behind the trailers again, clearly not wanting to be seen or identified by anyone who might be listening to the phone conversation. Maria turned and ran, repeatedly telling her boyfriend to hurry and get help. Even in her terror, she was still afraid of getting in trouble for sneaking out, which shows how the fear of parental disappointment can cloud judgment even in genuinely dangerous situations. She ran across the main road to a small convenience store and hid behind an ice machine in the parking lot. From this position, she could peek out just enough to see the man's semi-truck drive slowly past the store. She watched him scanning the parking lot, clearly searching for her with the persistence of someone who wasn't ready to give up his hunt. The truck stopped for a moment as the driver continued his visual search. When he didn't spot Maria in her hiding place, she saw him shake his head in what appeared to be disappointment before finally driving away. But even after he was gone, Maria didn't feel safe enough to emerge from her hiding spot. When her friend arrived to pick her up, Maria broke down crying from the stress and fear of the encounter. His girlfriend helped calm her down during the drive home, where Maria's own boyfriend was waiting with a lecture about the dangers of going out alone at night. The experience completely shattered Maria's assumptions about safety. She had always believed that her appearance, not conventionally attractive in her own estimation, made her invisible to predators. She learned that night that predators don't discriminate based on conventional standards of beauty. They look for opportunity and vulnerability. Maria realized how lucky she had been. If her phone had died, if her friend hadn't been available to pick her up, if she hadn't trusted her instincts about avoiding the dark street, any of these factors could have resulted in her becoming another missing person statistic. The incident taught her that predators are often patient and calculating, willing to wait and watch for the right moment to strike. The truck driver had clearly planned his approach, positioning himself to intercept her return journey and using the darkness and isolation to his advantage. Most importantly, Maria learned to trust her instincts completely. That inexplicable feeling of dread that made her choose a different route home had probably saved her life, even though at the time she couldn't articulate why she felt so afraid.